It all looked like just another regular NBA game. There were only a few seconds left on the clock, the score was already decided, and nothing suggested that this night would go down in history. But within seconds, everything spiraled out of control. A drink thrown from the stands flew through the air, hit a player on the court, and triggered a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. Players stormed into the crowd, fans fought back, and what was supposed to be a basketball game turned into complete chaos, broadcast live to the entire world. And the scariest part is that this wasn't an isolated moment. Throughout the 2000s, the NBA went through a series of events that didn't just challenge the league's control, they challenged its credibility. Historic fights, real-life tragedies, controversial decisions, and moments of extreme pressure created one of the most intense and unstable decades in sports history. It felt like behind the dunks and championships, there was always tension building, ready to explode. If you enjoy real, deep, and impactful sports stories like this, stories that show the human, chaotic, and often hidden side of sports, make sure to subscribe, because here we don't just tell you what happened. We help you understand what was really going on behind every moment. When Michael Jordan retired, the NBA lost far more than just the greatest player in its history. It lost the center of gravity that kept everything balanced. For years, Jordan wasn't just the face of the league, he was the league itself. His presence guaranteed ratings, global attention, and a clear narrative. Without him, the NBA entered a transition period that, at first glance, seemed stable. But underneath it was hiding growing instability. In the early 2000s, new talents began to rise and take the spotlight. Highly skilled players with strong personalities and unique styles started to fill the space left by Jordan. But this new generation didn't bring just talent. It brought intensity, emotion, and a completely different way of handling pressure. The game became more physical at times, more individual at others, and this gradual shift began to change behavior both on and off the court. At the same time, the league was still searching for a new identity. The audience wasn't the same. Fans weren't fully connected to the new stars. And there was a growing sense that something was missing. Everything was still working, but not with the same strength as before. It was like a structure still standing, but already showing cracks. And as happens in any environment going through change, that mix of pressure, expectation, and lack of direction started to create tension. Small conflicts began to appear, emotions started to overflow more frequently, and the line between control and chaos became thinner and thinner. The NBA still looked stable, but behind the scenes, something much bigger was about to explode. On November 19, 2004, what seemed like just another regular season game quickly turned into the most shocking moment in NBA history. The Indiana Pacers faced the Detroit Pistons in a game that was already decided. Only a few seconds remained on the clock. The Pacers were comfortably ahead, and despite the physical play, everything was still within what you would expect from two teams with an intense rivalry. It was the kind of game that would end without headlines, at least until that moment. It all started with a hard foul by Ron Artest on Ben Wallace. The contact was strong, unnecessary for that moment in the game, and it immediately triggered a reaction. Wallace got up and shoved Artest, other players rushed in, and within seconds the court was filled with tension. Still, nothing too unusual. Situations like this had happened before. Referees and security stepped in, separating players, and slowly it looked like things were calming down. Then came the image no one will ever forget. Artest, trying to avoid further conflict, lay down on the scorer's table, staring at the ceiling as if trying to disconnect from everything around him. For a few seconds, everything seemed strangely quiet, almost artificial. But that silence wasn't control. It was the final breath before collapse. Suddenly, a cup was thrown from the stands. It flew through the air and hit Artest directly. And in that exact moment, everything changed. Without hesitation, he got up and ran into the crowd, trying to find whoever threw it. But at that point, there was no control, no logic, no limits anymore. Other players followed, fans reacted, and within seconds, the NBA stopped being a game and turned into a full-scale confrontation. What followed was absolute chaos. Players fighting fans, people running across the stands, security completely unable to contain the situation. The live broadcast showed images that felt impossible for an event at that level. This wasn't just a fight, it was the complete breakdown of the barrier between sport and audience. And in that moment, in front of millions watching, it became clear that the NBA was no longer in control. While the world was still trying to process what happened that night in Detroit, the NBA was hit by something even deeper. Something that had nothing to do with rivalry, arguments, or officiating. It was something no sport can control. Loss. In a decade already marked by tension, the league began facing real tragedies that reminded everyone that behind the jerseys were fragile lives and stories that could end without warning. In January 2000, Bobby Fields lost his life in a car accident after leaving practice with the Charlotte Hornets. The news completely shook the team. Players who had been competing alongside him just hours earlier suddenly had to deal with the shock of a permanent absence. There was no preparation for that, no answers, just silence. A few months later, another tragedy struck. Malice died after being hit by a drunk driver while driving home after celebrating Kevin Garnett's birthday. The cruel irony of that moment, a celebration turning into loss, made everything even heavier. The NBA wasn't just going through a turbulent time on the court. Off the court, reality was even harsher. These events changed the atmosphere of the league. The arenas were still loud, the games continued, but something had shifted. There was an invisible weight, a shared understanding that everything could end at any moment. For many players, the game stopped being just competition and started to carry a different meaning, more urgent, more human. And maybe that was one of the most important turning points of the decade. Because in the middle of chaos, fights, and controversy, these losses reminded everyone of something essential. Before being athletes, they were people. And in that moment, the NBA wasn't dealing with entertainment. It was dealing with real life in its harshest form. While the league was still dealing with the emotional impact of those tragedies, the atmosphere on the court was becoming heavier than ever. Rivalries that were once purely competitive started to take on a more aggressive, more physical, and in some cases almost personal tone. Games were no longer just about winning. They carried a level of tension that could be felt in every possession. But it wasn't just the intensity of the players drawing attention. Gradually, another element started to move into the center of the conversation: officiating. Decisions began to be questioned more frequently, especially in high-pressure moments. Calls, or the lack of them, started to directly influence the outcome of important games, creating a growing sense of discomfort among players and fans. One of the most debated examples happened during the 2002 Western Conference Finals between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Sacramento Kings. That series, already intense by nature, took on an entirely different weight after extremely controversial decisions in Game 6. The number of free throws, the type of fouls called, and the timing of those calls raised questions that still haven't disappeared to this day. For many fans, that wasn't just a controversial game. It was something bigger, a breaking point. The idea that in certain moments, outcomes might not be decided purely on the court started to gain traction. And when that kind of doubt enters a sport, everything changes. From that moment on, every questionable call was analyzed more intensely. Every controversial decision fed the growing sense of distrust. And slowly, the narrative of that decade stopped being just about talent and competition and started to include suspicion, debate, and theories that still exist today. And some people believe that certain games were never supposed to end the way they did. Some games end when the clock hits zero. Others never really end. Throughout the 2000s, the NBA experienced moments like that. Plays that, even decades later, still generate debate among fans, analysts, and even former players. Game 6 between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Sacramento Kings in 2002 became the ultimate symbol of this. For many, that game wasn't just a decisive matchup. It was a turning point in how people viewed the league. The number of fouls called in the fourth quarter, especially in favor of the Lakers, immediately raised questions. Kings players showed visible frustration with every whistle, while the game slowly slipped away from them. Over time, that moment only grew in significance. Replays were analyzed over and over again. Commentators brought up new perspectives. Fans created theories that continue to circulate to this day. For some, it was simply human error under pressure. For others, it was something much harder to accept. But the impact goes beyond that single game. Because when something like that happens, it changes how every future game is perceived. Every questionable call carries more weight. Every controversial moment connects back to that growing history of doubt. And slowly, the viewer stops just watching the game and starts questioning everything around it. And that's exactly why moments like this never disappear. They stop being just part of history and become part of an ongoing conversation. A debate that crosses generations, divides opinions, and keeps alive the feeling that not everything was decided on the court. In the middle of all this chaos, there was one moment that stood out for a completely different reason. There was no fight, no tragedy, and no controversial call. And yet, it became one of the most iconic moments in NBA history. because this time the impact didn't come from a play. It came from words. Everything happened during a press conference with Allen Iverson. At that point, Iverson was already one of the most talented and most criticized players in the league. His style, both on and off the court, generated admiration and criticism in equal measure, and the pressure on him was constant. Every loss, every decision, every action was heavily scrutinized. During the interview, a reporter brought up a specific issue: his commitment to practice. It seemed like a simple, routine question, but the context behind it was much heavier. Iverson was dealing with personal issues, public criticism, and an environment that constantly questioned his attitude. And in that moment, something shifted. When he responded, Iverson repeated one word multiple times: practice. But it wasn't really about practice. It was a release. It was someone trying imperfectly to express that there were bigger things happening in his life at that moment. His words were interpreted in many different ways. Some saw it as carelessness. Others saw something much deeper. Over time, that speech became more than just an interview. It became a symbol, a reflection of the immense pressure athletes face, often without the public fully understanding it, because behind every player, there is a person. And in that moment, Iverson wasn't speaking as a superstar. He was speaking as someone at his limit. And maybe that's why that moment still resonates today. Because in a decade full of visible chaos, this was one of the few moments where the impact came from something invisible: the weight of simply living under constant pressure. When you look at the 2000s as a whole, it becomes difficult to ignore the pattern that was forming. It wasn't just one isolated event, or 2 or 3 unusual moments. It was a continuous sequence of events that, together, created the sense that something bigger was happening within the league. The NBA was growing in visibility, expanding globally, but at the same time, it seemed increasingly unstable internally. The fight between the Indiana Pacers and the Detroit Pistons showed that even the most basic boundary between players and fans could be broken. The tragedies reminded everyone that behind the spectacle were vulnerable lives. The officiating controversies raised doubts about the integrity of the game, and moments like Iverson's speech revealed the psychological weight players were carrying in silence. All of this happening at the same time started to build a dangerous narrative. The league was no longer seen only as high-level entertainment. In many moments, it felt like an environment on the edge of emotional, competitive, and even institutional collapse. Every new incident wasn't just another problem. It was another piece of a puzzle that was starting to make sense. And perhaps the most concerning part was the unpredictability. No one knew what the next major moment would be. Another fight? Another tragedy? Another controversial game? Every week carried the expectation that something unusual could happen. And while that attracted attention, it also increased the tension. The question began to emerge naturally, not just among fans but within the league itself. How sustainable was this? Because when chaos stops being an exception and becomes a pattern, it stops being surprising and starts becoming a problem. Faced with everything that was happening, the NBA reached a point where ignoring it was no longer an option. It wasn't just about protecting the league's image. It was about ensuring that the environment could remain sustainable in the long run. The chaos had exposed structural, emotional, and even cultural weaknesses within the sport. And for the first time in years, the league was forced to take a hard, honest look at itself. Changes began to happen clearly. Security at games was reinforced, especially after the Pacers vs. Pistons incident, which made it clear how easily control could be lost in extreme situations. The distance between players and fans became more protected, and stricter protocols were implemented to prevent anything similar from happening again. At the same time, the league started working on its image more strategically. New conduct rules were introduced, requiring players to maintain a more professional posture both on and off the court. The goal wasn't just to control behavior, it was to rebuild public perception. Trust had to be restored. On the court, the game itself began to evolve. The NBA looked to balance intensity with entertainment, reducing excessive physicality and creating a more fluid, offensive style of play. Gradually, the focus returned to skill, creativity, and spectacle, but now supported by a much stronger structure. And that's what made this turning point so powerful. Because the NBA didn't ignore the chaos, it learned from it. Every mistake, every crisis, every extreme moment became part of the foundation for a stronger, more global, and more prepared league. The 2000s weren't just another era in the NBA. They were a test. A period where the league was pushed to its absolute limits in every possible way. On the court, the intensity reached new levels. Off the court, pressure, tragedy, and controversy revealed a side of the game that few were prepared to see. It was a decade where control often felt like it was slipping away, where players crossed boundaries, where decisions created doubt, and where the weight of being a superstar became more visible than ever. But at the same time, it was exactly this collection of moments that shaped what the NBA would become. Because in the end, it wasn't success that transformed the league. It was chaos. It was the mistakes, the difficult moments, the crises, and the consequences that forced real evolution. The NBA we know today, more global, more structured, and more aware, was built directly from that turbulent period. And maybe that's why this decade still feels so relevant today. Because it wasn't perfect, it was intense, it was unpredictable, it was human. And now the question remains, was this the most chaotic decade in NBA history, or the most important one? If you made it this far, let me know what you think. Because this debate never really ends.